I am Sensei Tony, and welcome to the meditation service. Namo Furos, Namo Furos, Namo Furos. Let us celebrate the liturgy of the day. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge. I take refuge in the ground of being within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all of my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all things, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And may all come to know that peace which is born of insight and understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning. And since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. So tonight's Dharma talk has a very interesting, I think interesting title. It's Judgment Day, Apocalyptic Apoplexy. Preachers love alliteration, so it kind of flows out as natural. But I want to talk tonight about the obsession that humans have with the apocalypse, or the end of times, and discuss the meaning of that and what that can mean for us. So tonight's reading is going to be by the inimitable Richard Feynman. Now, some of you that are science geeks like myself will know the name Feynman very well. If you don't, I would recommend highly that you read all you can find on Richard Feynman, but one book in particular I'd recommend is Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. So probably one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, Nobel Prize winning physicist, and brilliant thinker, and all around really cool dude. So I'm going to read some quotes from him tonight as our preface. Authority may be a hint as to what the truth is, but is not the source of information. We must absolutely leave room for doubt, or there is no progress and no learning. The first way in which science is of value is familiar to everyone. It is that scientific knowledge which enables us to do all kinds of things and to make all kinds of things. Of course, if we make good things, it is not only to the credit of science, it is also to the credit of the moral choice which led us to good work. Scientific knowledge is an enabling power to do either good or bad, but it does not carry instructions on how to use it. Such power has evident value, even though the power may be negated by what one does. I learned a way of expressing this common human problem on a trip to Honolulu. In a Buddhist temple there, the man in charge explained a little bit about the Buddhist religion for us tourists, and then ended his talk by telling them he had something to say that they would never forget. And I have never forgotten it. It was a proverb of the Buddhist religion. To every man is given the key to the gates of heaven. The same key opens the gates of hell. Richard Feynman. So, I'm going to begin just briefly with a little bit of a personal experience at the end of times. As many of you know from the way I was raised, I grew up from the youngest age believing that the end of times was imminent. Now, unless you were raised that way, you really don't understand what that's like. However, there's probably a secular version of that today. I think a lot of the kids growing up today have that as well, unfortunately. But you grow up with this strange sort of fear and desire for the end of times. And I would say that the fear is probably just as strong because whatever promise that your faith had given you, you were always wondering if you hadn't done something to screw it up and that maybe you would be left behind. And it's interesting to me that when I was growing up, the only people that really obsessed about the end of the world were very conservative, fundamentalist religious folk. But that's changed. Just as in my comment about kids growing up today, the world has become obsessed with the apocalypse or the end of times. I can't imagine, or I can imagine, what it's like to grow up thinking that the earth at some point will become uninhabitable, and that if we don't do something now, we're done. And so those kids know exactly what it's like to grow up with that. Because for me it was, if you don't walk that dusty trail on Sunday up to the pulpit, if you don't lead a righteous life, then you shall be punished. You shall suffer. So I think a lot of kids today, unfortunately, have had that same experience. Now the problem with this type of thinking is that it's almost always wrong. If you look throughout human history and you look at all the prognostication that humans have engaged in, it's a very poor track record. And a lot of us have experienced it, before the end times that we're in now. A lot of us experienced it earlier. I remember when everybody was getting all worked up about the new millennium and how there was going to be all this cataclysm that would occur. Never happened. I can remember when 2012 was coming around and they were saying that the Mayan calendar was predicting the end. Never happened. I had a good friend who was a Jehovah's Witness. And they very heavily were invested in the idea of the end of the world. And boy, when they were calling for it, it looked bad. The world was engaged in its Second World War. Things looked really bad. Didn't happen. So there's one thing you do learn growing up the way I did, is you learn how to stop worrying and love the apocalypse. You learn how to stop worrying and love the apocalypse. That's my little homage to Stanley. So we have these stories, right? We have these stories about the end of time. And it's very interesting because most people aren't aware that there is a collection of fables called the Jataka Tales, which are a ancient Buddhist literature that many later stories were based on. For example, Aesop's fables that a lot of us grew up with. They have their origin in these tales. And these were tales told of the Buddha's previous life, his different lifetimes, where he was different animals and different people. And they're really good. One of these stories appears in a chapter called Buddhadharma, or some people say Dhamma. And this one in particular is called What the Hare Heard. Hare being a rabbit. And basically it starts out like this. Some of the Buddha's disciples are coming to him and talking to him about these strange ascetic practices that some people were doing, like lying down on a bed of thorns, or standing up and not moving for weeks at a time, talking about how these might develop one's spirit. And the Buddha comments by sort of cheerfully laughing them off. He says, there is no special merit in that sort of practice, but they are rather like the noise the hare heard. He then tells the story of a rabbit disturbed by a falling fruit, which hits his tail, and he believes the earth is coming to an end. The hare starts to stampede among the other animals, telling each one of them, watch out, the end of the world is coming. Do you want to get a chair? Okay. And so all the other animals begin to follow, and they all start rushing, following the hare. And then fortunately, there is a noble lion. And the lion halts the crowd of animals stampeding. And the lion says, what's happening? What's going on? And the hare says, well, the earth is going to open up. The end of the world is nigh. And the lion says, tell me where this happened. And so the lion and the hare go to the place where this happened. And when the lion has thoroughly investigated the situation, he assures the hare that all that he experienced was the falling of something onto his tail, and he panicked. And so he goes back and he tells all the other animals, and calm is restored. Now this story, of course, we know as it's come down through time in different iterations to us, right? And the one that most, I think, Americans grew up with was Chicken Little. And, I remember reading that, as a child or having that read to me. And then just for a little bit of study, I went back and looked at all the Warner Brothers cartoons. And there's a great cartoon version of Chicken Little. And the Chicken Little story is exactly the same as the story of the hare. And in the Chicken Little story, it's very similar. So Chicken Little is, experienced something falling on his head, and he thinks the sky is falling. And so he goes about telling everyone about it. And they kind of, Chicken Little, not the sharpest tool in the shed, so they don't really pay much attention to him. Then he goes to the leader of the community, this rooster, who's the head of the barnyard, and tells him, and he says, son, you're mistaken. Just take it easy. And so that would be the end of it, right? But it's not. And here's the reason. In the story of Chicken Little, there's someone behind the plot. And the person or the animal behind the plot is the fox. The fox has been trying to figure out for a long time how he can get all these animals into his stomach. And I'm going to go further with that story, but I'll leave you there. So, why do these stories keep appearing to us? Why is it with the story of the Buddha and the hare, or is it the story of Chicken Little? Why do these stories always appear to us? Why does it seem that humans are obsessed with this? Well, another angle on this idea comes from Carl Jung. Jung believed that apocalyptic thinking was an archetype, that it was somehow built into the structure of the collective unconsciousness. And that's why it appears over and over again, that it serves some psychological purpose. So I'm going to take all those ideas, bring them together, and try to present something that will give you both a negative way within which to understand the meaning of the apocalypse, or a positive way to understand the meaning of the apocalypse. And just like I said earlier from the quote by Richard Feynman, the keys to heaven and the keys to hell are the same keys. And before I say that, let me also I like to define my terms. I use the word apocalyptic, and a lot of people think that apocalypse just means like the end. And in fact, some dictionary definitions have that. But the real meaning in Greek of the apocalypse is to reveal something that is hidden. To reveal something that has been hidden and bring it to light. That's the deeper and truer meaning, which is something I'm going to attempt tonight. Apoplexy is a loss of consciousness which leads to death or seizures or stroke. So apoplexy is this experience of being frozen and struck down. So when you have apocalyptic apoplexy, it basically means that something hidden is being revealed, and what it reveals will strike you. It will seize you. So it's very powerful. So what's some positive things that we might get? Or actually, before we go to the positive, let's go into the negative. I always like my use that way first. And this will tie us back to the story of Chicken Little a little bit as well. So Chicken Little, in that story, the fox is very smart. And he actually is, in the cartoon version of Warner Brothers, which came out like in the late 40s, he actually pulls out a book of psychology. So he's trying to figure out how to get all the animals in his stomach, and he pulls out this book of psychology. He's going to find the strategies to get them. So here's what he does. So here's the first step that you want to do if you have the desire to use an apocalyptic fear to seize people, and especially to control them, to make them do something that you want. So here's the first step. Choose the youngest and most gullible. That's why he chose Chicken Little. Because he looked all through the barnyard at all the different characters. And he said, no, that guy, that's the youngest one, and he's the most gullible. That's the one I would use. And then, step 2 is you have to undermine the leadership. So in other words, when the rooster says, oh, that's ridiculous. You're reading way too much into that, Chicken Little. You have to undermine that person. Third, by flattery, take persons who are formerly insignificant and convince them that they are born leaders. Step 4, get the leader to corral everyone into your cave. So in the story of Chicken Little, the fox first takes a piece, paints it blue, throws it, hits him in the head. Chicken Little goes, oh man, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. He goes to the rooster, and the rooster says, calm down, son. You're going way overboard here. And at first that works, right? But then the fox starts spreading stories about the rooster and how the rooster is unreliable, how the rooster is greedy and just out for his own power, and he doesn't really care about the rest of the birds. And so it goes to all the chicks, and of course everything starts squawking, and pretty soon people are sort of like, I don't know if we can trust the rooster. And so his authority is undermined. And then the fox says to Chicken Little, people have never recognized you before, but I see that you are a brilliant little chicken. And you're a natural-born leader of chickens. You should now replace the rooster as the person in charge. And of course, the rest of the chickens are a little bit off balance anyway, because the rooster, who's been the authority for a long time, is no longer being held in the same sway. And Chicken Little starts doing his thing, and people start following Chicken Little. And what does Chicken Little say? Chicken Little says, the end is coming. The sky is falling. We must go somewhere to be safe. And so all the animals stampede into a cave that the fox has cleverly told Chicken Little would be a safe place. And all the animals run into the cave. Reason is lost. Fear reigns. And finally they're all in their cave, and they're sitting in their cave, locked off from the rest of the world in their isolation, and they feel safe for a moment. And then the fox enters the cave. And one by one, he has his way. I don't know about you, but I thought that story was fantastic. I thought it was a fantastic parable and explanation of what happens when people are seized by an apocalyptic idea. And here's the negative consequences of such a thing. The first thing is, just like with all the chickens that began to back Chicken Little, they're characteristically pseudonymous. Now, what does pseudonymous mean? A lot of people don't know what that means. Pseudonymous means essentially that individual words no longer become important. What becomes important is the group's thought. So that's something that occurs first. And if everyone argues, or anyone argues or disputes what the group is saying, then like the Banderlog from Kipling's A Jungle Book. And Banderlog means a group of monkeys that are chattering in Hindi. And here's what they say, the monkeys. We all say it is so, and so it must be true. We all say it is so, and so it must be true. We all say it is so, and it must be true. So that any individual who challenges it is shut down. It takes then a narrative form, employs esoteric language, expresses a pessimistic view of the present, and treats the final events as imminent. And imminent so that a gateway belief may be, the cave may be expressed. And that's how it always happens. There's always esoteric language. So it doesn't matter if it's a religious version or it's a secular version. It follows the same patterns because it's following the same psychological process that the Buddha knew about 3,000 years ago and the writers of Chicken Little knew about. And somehow we've forgotten that this is just wisdom. It's wisdom that humans have known forever, as long as humans have been wise. And yet, we forget. We forget. The esoteric language of religion is all these strange symbols, 666, the number of the beast, the Antichrist, at least in the Christian version. And the irony there is that that was considered esoteric, and to this day it's considered esoteric, right? Even though Hebrew scholars have now identified that it was not 666, it was 667. Doesn't seem as spooky. And that the Jews often used language conversions to numbers because, yeah, they were an occupied people. They were being occupied by the Roman Empire. And Nero was the one in charge at the time that they were facing their greatest opposition. And so they would translate a name into numbers. Well, guess what those numbers represent? Nero. So you see, when you understand it, it's not so great and mysterious. But I grew up having that title laid on every person that every new preacher thought was the Antichrist. And the mark of the beast, that's easy. That's easy. So the esoteric language is how religions do it. You know what the esoteric language of today is? And I say this to you as a person who's devoted his life to the conversation between science and spirituality and the importance of a scientific continuity with our spiritual understanding. It's the language of science. Scientists do it all the time. They talk to you in an arcane language that they expect you not to understand, like a special priesthood. Or worse yet, they throw graphs at you, which are almost uninterpretable. And they use that esoteric language to confuse you. And you go, well, you're not smart enough to do it. They express a pessimistic view of the present. And they treat final events as imminent, which leads to gateway beliefs which allow for control. So that's a problem. That's a problem for human beings. Why is that a problem? Because that's what you end up with. You end up like the chickens in the cave. You've lost your ability to reason. And you've lost your ability to question. And if you question, you're quickly thrown out. And as Feynman said, Richard Feynman said in my quote, if we do not have the ability to doubt and to question everything, then we have lost everything. There's no way that wisdom will manifest. So yeah, that's the negative part of the apocalyptic thinking. But there's a positive part, because remember, the idea is that this is a hidden meaning, a hidden thing, which when it comes to light, seizes you. And seizure is not always a bad thing. Sure, seizure can be a negative thing, but seize can also mean a good thing, carpe, right? Like carpe diem, right? Seize the day. So it can also be a call to liberation, to awakening. And that's how I believe that we should look, or could look, at the apocalypse. So what's the positive aspect of it? Well, one of the reasons that we seem to really like it is that apocalyptic thinking tries to present a very honest view of humankind. If you think about all the stories, my son and I just watched this really great one called Into the Forest with Ellen Page. And it's a great apocalyptic little movie that came out this year on Netflix. But all of them kind of try to give you a snapshot of what mankind or humankind is like. And most of the time, I will say it's negative. Excuse me. But in every story, like this story that we watched of these two young women who were left in the forest after their father died and faced all these oppositions, the bravery and the love that they had for each other, that's what it's really telling us about humanity. So while it's an apocalyptic tale, and I hardly recommend it really isn't about the bad guys. It's really not about this strange, mysterious thing that shut off all electrical power in the world. It's really about these two young women and how they cope with death, how they cope with the struggle for life, and how they cope with change, how they cope with their fears. And that's what it can teach us. It allows us, when we watch those kind of things, we don't feel so powerless because we see examples of how we might be. So it's kind of a call to courage or a call to heroism, that we see that, yes, even in the end of times, we can still stand tall. The other thing that I think is positive around the idea of an apocalypse is clean slate. everything's going to be wiped out. So you kind of get to start fresh. And so whether the apocalypse is something that you think of in a big way or you think of in your own life, the apocalypse is you've experienced. Like the second principle of oneness tells us, if we can see the opportunity in these changes, even the terrible ones, they allow us to create something new and a new way of being. The other thing that I think apocalyptic thinking does for us is it validates a personal trauma. In other words, it's sort of, when we go through a trauma of our own, when we see it happening on a large scale, there's a sense of validation. I think there's a sense of connection that we get from it. Sort of like the first principle of oneness, where suffering is expressed and taught because that's the easiest way for us to connect to each other. Because that's how we're all equal, through the common denominator of our suffering. And it also can be cathartic. One of the experiences I have with that, the religious version, not so much, but well, somewhat, and then the secular version for me growing up was Planet of the Apes. That was the one I loved. It allowed me to cathartically think about, what do I do when things end? How do I cope with things when they end, when they come to an end? And it really, I think, the final thing I will say about it is that it can help us to kind of figure out what I'm about personally. And that it can seize us to find meaning in the midst of the end. Because the reality is that the end is near. It's always near. We have no idea what's going to happen from the moment we leave this room, this space. We literally don't. I can remember firsthand having someone here, right here in this temple, and an hour, 2 hours later, dead. We don't know when the end is coming. And trust me, no human knows when the end is coming. No more than Chicken Little. So the end is always nigh, but we can change. We can use that impulse, that attraction, whatever you call it, we can use that as an opportunity to seize our lives now and live our lives out of liberation now. Because the end will come. And there's nothing any of us can do about it. And in fact, just as all the old mythological symbols and imagery showed, the end was always the prelude to a rebirth. And so there's nothing to fear. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us recite together the 4 immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless, I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless, I vow to embody them. The way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. Let us share the precepts for the community of the vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life and all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. So this is the time where we will offer incense. If you're at home observing, please offer incense at this time. And then we will be also chanting together. And then we will sit and abide quietly as well together. So let us begin. Tonight we will chant the Heart Sutra. And if you don't know it, just follow along. Gate, gate, Pera gate, 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 Bodhiswa, gate, gate, Pera gate, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa. Gate, gate, Pera gate, 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 Bodhiswa, gate, gate, Pera gate, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa. Gate, gate, Pera gate, 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 Bodhiswa, gate, gate, Pera gate, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa. Gate, gate, Pera gate, 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 Bodhiswa, gate, gate, Pera gate, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa. Gate, gate, Pera gate, 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 Bodhiswa, gate, gate, Pera gate, Pera samgate, Bodhiswa. knowing that we never practice alone or just for ourselves, let us offer our lives to the Bodhisattva. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. Namo. 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 That concludes tonight's service. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.